previous video, we learned how to make complex tables more accessible, but for tables with 3 levels of headers, we need to do things a bit differently. So as you can see here, we have the same exact table that we had in the previous video, and what we're going to do is we're going to add another header here. We're going to add a 3rd level header. So I'm just going to switch over to our text editor here, and first we need to change these to span across 4 columns, and we need our apples to span across 2 columns, and I'll just go ahead and copy and paste that there. And lastly, we need a 3rd row here, and this is a little bit intricate, so I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste that in. And here we have 2 varieties of apples, Washington and Fuji, and we have them for both premium quality and regular quality. And lastly, we need to change the states here to span across 9 columns instead of 7. And when we go ahead and switch back to the browser and refresh, you can see that we now have our 2 varieties of apples. Now, in addition to the headers, we need to go ahead and add in some data for these new varieties. So I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste that in now. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy it here, and I'm going to replace the entirety of the T body, just like that. And when I switch back and refresh, you can see that we now have our data there. Now we need to add in the IDs and headers to associate the table cells to the proper headers. But we've added in a 3rd level of headers here, and we need to do things a bit differently. Basically, we need to add the headers attribute to the lower level table headers, and we also need to account for the new data that we've added in. So I'm just going to go ahead and switch back to my text editor here, and once again I'm going to replace the entirety of the T head. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste this in just like that. So here's what our new header will look like. The top level header only has IDs just like before. These haven't changed. What has changed are the 2nd and 3rd level headers. At the 2nd level, we use the headers attribute to notate the header that's 1 level above it, which you can see right here. Then we give that header an ID. At the 3rd level here, we use the headers attribute to notate both of the headers that are above it, separated by spaces, just like we did with the table cells in the previous video, and then we go ahead and give it an ID. With this ID, as with the other IDs that are at the lower levels, we note what the header cell contains and then append some notes about the previous header cells. I'd like to mention that these IDs can be formatted however you'd like. You don't have to use dashes as I have. The only important thing is that you're consistent with your coding conventions. Now let's go ahead and move on to the T body. We don't need to reference the T head ID attributes in the T body header attributes. So when we get to New York State here, for example, we can treat that as the top level header again, and just give it the ID of New York. No header attributes are required. When we get down to the next level of canned or fresh, we do need the headers attribute. I'm going to go ahead and paste in a new table body, and then I'll go ahead and continue with this explanation. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this T body and just paste it in just like that. So if you look at the header cells for fresh and canned, you can see that we're using the headers attribute once again to denote the state, which you can see right here. But we're not naming off any of the previous headers because they're in the T head and we're currently inside of the T body. Then we're using the ID attribute to notate whether or not they're canned or fresh, and once again we're appending the abbreviated name of the state. And finally, down in the headers attributes for the table cells, which you can see right here, we just have to add in the IDs for Washington and Fuji apples, which also have appended to them whether or not they're regular or premium, which you can see right here. Going through this, you've seen how tricky it can be to apply the proper header attributes to the correct table cells. Fortunately, in the context of a web application, you can dynamically generate the headers attribute for each table cell. You just have to make sure that they match up to the correct header. Creating complex tables like this should be avoided if at all possible, but if you do need to make a complex table, you should now know how to make it accessible.